Ravi's asks, what does the rise of China mean for the future of Silicon Valley and technology more generally? You alluded to it earlier, Peter. Talk a bit more about this. To me, this is the fascinating thing. Europeans blew this. They're nowhere. They don't really have any major technology companies. But the Chinese, perhaps as much by accident as by design, kept the US technology companies at bay and allowed their own so-called BAT companies, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, to flourish. And now these are the real rivals for the Silicon Valley companies. And yet their relationship with government's completely different from the relationship that we've been talking about in the United States. It's far from the hostile relationship that we see between Silicon Valley and Washington today. They're hand in glove. So talk a little bit about what you think China's success in technology means for Silicon Valley. Is the future perhaps there rather than here?
Well, it's badly underestimated in Silicon Valley. And I do think Alibaba and Tencent in particular, at some point are going to be trying to expand outside of China. I expect that they will try to do so in a fairly aggressive way, and and I think people in Silicon Valley are probably fairly myopic about that. Maybe in the U.S. generally, and certainly the question of what year does China overtake the U.S. This was a very big question people asked, say, in 2005, 2006, 2007. We're 13 years closer to that than we were in 2005. And we seem to be asking the question much less today than we were 13 years ago, even though we're presumably 13 years closer to when that happens. And it's almost as though we've stopped thinking about it as the date has gotten closer. My calculation would be if you look at it on a PPP basis, China's already overtaken us. GDP, it's like 2030. If you do an average of purchasing power parity and GDP, which I think is a better measure than either of the two alone, you get to about 2020. It's going to happen in 3 years, 4 years, and that's barely registering as a conversation here.
Reed. So, since there was a request for Peter and I to disagree, the specific thing that I would disagree with Peter on is I actually don't think Silicon Valley is blind to China. I think Silicon Valley is quite aware that in the entire world, the shape of the technological future, the most significant contender is China. They worry about the protected Chinese market. There's a whole variety of Silicon Valley companies that can't play within China. They worry about more support from the government and anything from data to kind of generally labor laws. They worry about the fact that there is a city in China that's graduating 1 million engineers every year, let alone the whole thing. And so that's part of the reason why Silicon Valley tends to be such a large advocate of, especially high-end immigration, although all to some degree of fairness, but that's the, how do we play against that? And, part of when I, meet with various European government officials, I say, look, you're really focused on Silicon Valley, but what we're worried about is what the future looks like vis-a-vis China, and there's all these issues. And I think if you went around and talked to every single medium to large company within Silicon Valley, they're all thinking about what does the China market look like, what does competition with China look like. Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu are highly innovative companies. There's a lot of interesting things that they're doing. There's things that we now have, kind of ideas and copies of startups here that are of ideas that are made in China, right? I mean, there's a ton of these things going on. And so the specific disagreement is actually, in fact, Silicon Valley treats this as a very serious threat indeed. And, it's kind of, it's either healthy competition, which I think Peter thinks is an oxymoron, or a contest for the future.
So you're the perfect people to ask a follow-up question on this. I was just a couple of weeks ago in Hangzhou, which is the headquarters of Alibaba. But you don't just need to go there, you can go anywhere, and you'll see that in financial technology, China is a long way ahead. Why is it that we don't pay for everything with PayPal, but the Chinese pay for everything with Alipay or WeChat Pay? I mean, to the extent that you do not see a credit card, and when Chinese people come to the United States, they chortle at our antiquated behavior. You guys were way ahead of China in thinking about an online payment system, and yet, from where I'm sitting, they've completely overtaken Now, I would love to know why you think that is, because all I see when I go to China is ubiquitous online payment systems that have become
This
dominant.
is not just payments. I mean, there are all sorts of places where if you're a undeveloped country, you can go straight to the technological frontier. Whereas if you're reasonably developed, maybe the delta is not that big, and so it's slower to adopt things. And so you would find the same thing to be true of mobile payments in the developing world generally versus the developed world.
And Pesa
or,
in Kenya.
E-commerce is much bigger in China as a percent of commerce because people never built big retail stores. I think Japan has, the most elaborate, retail industry, and that's probably the country where you have the smallest percent of e-commerce. And it's not because, Japan's unusually backward, but because the old economy of Japan actually functioned reasonably well. And, the payment system in the U.S. is not seamlessly efficient, but it is, it works reasonably well. It's not a trivial thing to start a new payments company. You have to always, find something where there's a big delta that, can really drive an intense need for adoption. And having something that's just a little bit better for a lot of people is often a very difficult technology to drive out.
Jack Ma said something at Davos last week which really struck home for me, namely that the Chinese model would work better in emerging markets, pretty much for the reason you've just given. And that left me wondering if essentially companies like Alibaba will be able to roll out their platforms really easily in emerging markets, and the Silicon Valley companies may be left with just the developed world. Is that a scenario that you think is plausible?
One of the things I've been saying for a few years is there's three internets. There's the English internet, the Chinese internet, and everything else. And where the actual combat will be is in the everything else.
Right. And who do you think will win in that contest? Is it conceivable that, in fact, the Chinese companies, that BAT could beat FANG?
Very conceivable.
What do you think?
Yes, but I still disagree with Reed that this is generally understood in Silicon Valley because the big Chinese companies so dominate China that people in Silicon Valley don't even think they can break into China that much. When they don't think they can break in, they don't think about it that much. And so one of the benefits for China of the sort of state champions of the Chinese firewall is that there's no incentive for us to think about what's going on in China that much because it's gotten so hard to do anything. And so I think whenever China starts to do things aggressively outside of it, we will not be paying as much attention as we should.